Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment to ask you to check me out on Patreon. There are several tiers with great benefits, including ad-free episodes delivered early to patrons. You can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com through Buy Me a Coffee or through e-transfer at crwbaird@gmail.com. Donations help keep the show going. I've also released my first history book, Canada's Main Street, the epic story of the Trans-Canada Highway. You can find it in most bookstores in Canada and through online retailers. You can find the links for Patreon, donating, and my book in my show notes. Okay, let's get to the show. Frank Frederickson stood on the deck of the ship as it sailed on the Mediterranean Sea. Months ago, he had enlisted to fight in the First World War. Now, his home in Winnipeg seemed a world away. Before long, he would be in Egypt to begin pilot training. The war, however, seemed distant. The bombs and the screams of the trenches were thousands of kilometers north. But soon the battle would come to him when a U-boat, hiding beneath the waves, deployed an explosive payload into the side of the ship. Amidst the panic and smoke, Frank had to find a way off the ship. But he needed to get one thing first: his violin. I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X. This month, I'm focusing on Canada's Olympic history, and in this episode, we travel to 1920 and the start of our hockey dominance on the international stage. This is the story of the Winnipeg Falcons. When we talk about hockey, most people think about Canada, and we'll get there. But the start of the Winnipeg Falcons doesn't start in the Great White North. It starts in Iceland, in 1874 to be exact. 1,000 years after the Norse first arrived in Iceland, King Christian IX of Denmark visited the small island, and his visit coincided with Denmark granting Iceland its own constitution and limited rule over domestic matters. But the Icelanders had been living for a while in hardship. The economy was suffering, and years of poor weather led to constant crop failures. If things weren't bad enough, after centuries of dormancy, Askja, a volcano in the central highlands, erupted. For 17 hours on March 28, 1875, ash rained down across 5,000 square kilometers, covering everything on its path and poisoning land and livestock. Within a year, 2% of the sheep and 7% of the cattle were dead, and over the next 30 years, 20,000 Icelanders, or 25% of the population, left the island. That great migration was aided by a Scottish missionary named John Taylor in the spring of 1875. He encouraged Icelanders, Sigurdur Johannsson and Einar Johannsson, to travel with him to find a new home in Canada. And they arrived in Winnipeg on July 20th and were immediately impressed by what they saw. 2 months later, 200 Icelandic immigrants arrived in Manitoba on September 25th. They then traveled by flatboat along the Red River to the western shore of Lake Winnipeg, where the Canadian government had promised them land. The new arrivals named it New Iceland. Life in their new home wasn't easy. They had been expert fishermen in the North Atlantic, but now they had to adapt to the shallowness of Lake Winnipeg. And it didn't help that soon after they arrived, Winnipeg had one of its coldest winters on record. The new arrivals had unsuitable clothing for the weather, and by the time the snow melted that spring, 35 people had died from scurvy that had spread like wildfire. And at the time, Manitoba was known as the postage stamp province and was just 1/18th its current size. This meant that New Iceland was independent of the government. The residents set their own laws, had their own schools, and managed their own affairs. They even had their own newspaper, Framfari, meaning the Progress. And at first, the Icelanders had been welcomed, but that isolation and their refusal to integrate into the broader society soon led to backlash, and public opinion turned on them. The Manitoba Free Press called them an unprogressive race who should succumb to the fate of the least fit. But despite this hostility, more Icelanders followed, and by 1876, New Iceland had an additional 1,200 people. And over time they learned to work the soil, fish, and build houses that could handle the frigid Canadian winter. But times were still tough. A smallpox epidemic swept through the colony in 1877, followed by a series of floods and harsh winters, which led to an exodus from the colony. Some moved to North Dakota, others established the community of Gimli, which today has the largest Icelandic population outside of Iceland. By 1881, the population of New Iceland had quickly declined. It had gone from thousands to just 250 people. And Manitoba as a province had been expanding, and that same year it had grown to the point that it now took over New Iceland's land. It marked the official end of the colony and a new beginning for the few that had remained, including a newfound love for a game synthesized in the Great White North. By the mid-1800s, British settlers had adapted European stick and ball games that they used to play back home to the colony's frozen ponds and rivers. And Canada's long winters made ice a natural playing surface, and on March 3rd, 1875, the first recorded indoor hockey game was played at Victoria's Skating Rink in Montreal. To better control the game indoors, players used a flat wooden puck instead of a ball, and that innovation became permanent. By 1877, students at McGill University had published the first written rules of the game they called hockey, formalizing team sizes and basic penalties and gameplay structure. And from there, organized clubs and leagues and standardized equipment followed rapidly. In Winnipeg, the children of the first Icelandic arrivals had grown up with the game, and by the mid-1890s, those children were now adults wanting to keep playing the game they had grown to love. David Grebstad, author of A Confluence of Destiny, said that at the time, hockey was booming in Canada.
Started in the 1890s, 1880s, and then slowly into the 1890s in Western Canada, hockey just took off, and lots of people were playing hockey. I mean, we as Canadians love it as it is, but it seems like even at the time, it was probably even more popular at the time.
His book tells the in-depth story of the Falcons' quest for Olympic gold, and he mentions that at the time, prejudice towards the Icelandic immigrants prevailed. Their odd-sounding names didn't fit into a society where French and British culture dominated. They were outsiders, and no one wanted to play Canada's game with them or allow them to play it on their turf. So with no other options, they formed the Icelandic Athletic Club and the Winnipeg Vikings hockey teams. The two teams were divided by Notre Dame Street, which today runs through several central and northwestern neighborhoods, starting near the downtown core. The Icelandic Athletic Club was on the north, the Vikings in the south. The Winnipeg Tribune wrote in 1899, "This creates no small amount of enthusiasm in the Icelandic people living on their respective sides of the street, which could easily be seen and heard by the noise and excitement that prevailed all through the match." The Vikings were more physical and a stronger team, while the Athletic Club was small and fast on the ice. Of the two teams, the Vikings had more skill and won the Icelandic League Championship every single year from 1897 to 1902. But a two-team league wasn't sustainable, and the league eventually folded, although the teams continued to play whenever they could. In 1905, the Icelandic Athletic Club applied to join the Manitoba Junior Hockey League, and they were declined. 3 years later, the Vikings and the Athletic Club decided to make one single team out of their best players. This new super team would need a new name, and for that, they chose the national bird of Iceland, the falcon. The Winnipeg Falcons were officially established in 1908. And at the same time, a young teenager was skating on outdoor rinks in the city. Sigurður Franklin Friksson, who went by the first name of Frank, was born to Icelandic immigrants Jean and Gvuthlog. But as long as he could remember, he had spoken Icelandic at home. In fact, he only learned English when he began school. And by the time he was 5, he was bilingual, and his parents made an ice rink in the backyard where he learned to skate. And Frank was good, and before long he was playing organized hockey with whatever team would take him. And by the time he was a teenager, he was taller and stronger than most of the other players on the ice. He was also a born leader. He joined the Winnipeg Falcons in the 1913-14 season and was immediately named captain. This was the same season that the Falcons became part of the Independent Hockey League. It didn't start out great for the team in that league, though. That team finished in last place. But under his guidance and leadership, they won the league championship the following year. It seemed that everything was looking up and they were on their way to glory. But then, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was killed on June 28, 1914, and that blocked the team's chances at greatness. Across the pond, the First World War erupted, and Canada sent thousands of men from every walk of life who had enlisted to serve overseas. Out of 8 million people, 619,000 joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Frank Frederickson always led by example, and he was the first to enlist from the Falcons. And within days, 7 of the 8 players had their new uniforms too, except these were military khakis. 5 of the players were placed with the 223rd Canadian Scandinavians Battalion, commanded by the team executive Hans Hannesson. The remaining Falcon players were sent to other battalions. Frank Thorstensen went to the 209th Battalion, while George Cumbers, a skilled locomotive mechanic, reported to the Canadian Railway troops. Except for Cumbers, the rest of the team was sent to Camp Hughes in Manitoba to begin training. And while waiting to be shipped overseas, the Falcon players joined the Winnipeg Patriotic League and played together for the battalion's hockey team. The following spring, the battalion was shipped to England, and for years, the Winnipeg Falcons had fought on the ice together. Now, they were separated and sent to different corners of the war. Frank Thorstensen found himself in the 10th Battalion. He arrived at the Vimy Ridge trenches on April 28, 1917, mere weeks after the Canadian Corps had achieved a stunning victory and pushed back the Germans. But the small win didn't mean they were done fighting. Frank fought from August 15th to 25th, 1917 at the Battle of Hill 70, where Canada suffered 9,000 casualties. Frank escaped unharmed, but with little time to catch his breath. By October 1917, Frank was fighting the Germans at Passchendaele. By the time the battle was over, and the Canadians had captured the ridge on November 6th, 16,000 were dead or wounded. Once again, Frank escaped injury. He got a break from the fighting in December 1917, but didn't escape the horror. The welcome reprieve was thanks to the mumps. He spent weeks in the hospital, away from the explosions, the constant screams, and the stench of death of the trenches. But he spent the nights listening to the sound of his comrades as they healed from wounds. The fight never seemed too far away. And during that time, sitting in the hospital, he likely thought of his fellow Falcons scattered across the continent. He had escaped death in 2 battles, but had they? By February 1918, he was back in the trenches. By March 12th, the raiding party he had been assigned to was near a place called Twisted Alley. They'd been tasked with blocking a trench intersection known as Humbug Alley. In the chill of the late spring air and under the cover of night, the men made their way across no man's land. And their silence was broken by the dreaded whistling sound across in the sky. It wasn't an artillery shell, whiz-bangs as the soldiers called them, but gas canisters. Since 1915, poison gas had become an unfortunate reality of the war, used by both sides. The raiding party scrambled to put on their gas masks as quickly as they could as they rushed back to the trench. Soon the grim reality of the failed raid became apparent. 1 officer and 3 soldiers were wounded by enemy fire. 7 were suffering the effects of poison gas. Frank was one of them. As his condition worsened, he was evacuated to a hospital at Berlin. It was too late. For 2 days he lingered on this earth as his lungs burned. Each breath became more difficult as they filled with fluid. He took his last, painful gasp on March 13th, 1918. The other Falcons didn't find out about the death of their teammate for weeks. The hockey team from Winnipeg had been scattered across Europe. While some enjoyed the camaraderie of the trenches, others looked at the clouds and saw freedom in flight. They wanted to be knights of the sky. 3 Falcons players, Hebby Axford, Connie Johansson, and hockey captain Frank Frederickson, all wanted to leave the confines of the infantry to be able to soar like, well, Falcons. Hebby Axford became a flight commander and rose to the rank of captain. He eventually earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for his service. Connie Johansson became a flight instructor at an airfield in Egypt, where he remained in the relative safety for the duration of the war as he trained English and Egyptian pilots. Falcon captain Frank Frederickson had a more eventful time, including brushes with death. First, he trained in England and France, and then traveled to Egypt to train with his teammate Connie. He became a pilot scout and quickly proved himself in flight. He would be needed on the Western Front, and when his transfer orders came in, he was heading back to Britain. Frank was supposed to enjoy a relatively leisurely journey across the Mediterranean Sea, but a German U-boat had other plans. On May 28, 1917, his transport was torpedoed. Over 90 men lost their lives, but Frank managed to escape with his cherished violin when he jumped on a lifeboat to safety. The survivors drifted for days until they were rescued. When he finally arrived in Britain, he trained at an RAF base in Scotland. As soon as he arrived, he impressed his commander so much that he was made an instructor and test pilot. That wasn't a bad thing. After all, life expectancy for pilots above the French trenches was just 20 hours of flight time. But that didn't mean that Frank was free of danger. And some of it was, well, self-caused. While stationed in Scotland, a woman caught his eye. Wanting to impress her, he took a British biplane fighter plane and flew over a tea party she was hosting in Edinburgh. He was hoping to impress her by performing aerial tricks. Unfortunately, the engine failed and the plane crashed. Frank, thankfully, only suffered bruises and multiple cuts. He had a few more close calls while piloting those experimental aircrafts, but survived the war and returned to Canada in 1919. As for the other Falcons, Robert Benson, Wally Byron, and Gudmundur Sigurd-Johnson was posted with the 27th Winnipeg Battalion in France, and while they all had their shares of scrapes and near misses, all three returned to Winnipeg following the war. And while the other Falcons were scattered, George Cumber was with the No. 13 Light Railway Operation Company. He wouldn't be in the trenches fighting the Germans. Instead, he was in the rail yards, servicing locomotives for the military. But when the whole world is in conflict, war has a funny way of finding you. His unit was camped out near Marille, France, on March 18, 1918. And although they were about 8 kilometers away from Vimy Ridge, the 20 soldiers had sat down for breakfast in relative quiet. Now, whether it was sent deliberately or just went off course due to poor German calculations, an artillery shell suddenly shrieked through the air and landed at their breakfast table. Every single one of them was killed. Author David Grebstad said that George Cumbers and Frank Thorstensen were the only Falcon lives lost to the war.
The two of them died within days of each other passing, and they're both buried in the same military cemetery, just mere feet from one another. So it's a pretty interesting story, and very, very sad, obviously.
The rest of the Winnipeg hockey team returned to Canada, and that's where they grieved their teammates, and they would honor them in their own way, by becoming legends on the ice. The Falcons had endured countless injuries and experienced loss. For their service, they received medals and 2 of their friends never returned. But their sacrifices didn't seem to matter. The hockey community in Winnipeg still didn't welcome them. Falcons captain Frank Frederickson said, "We couldn't get into the senior league because the players were from well-to-do families and wanted no part of us." Author David Grebstad said that Winnipeg still didn't care for those with Icelandic heritage.
And they ran into a lot of obstacles, it seemed. And it was openly mentioned by some sports writers in the paper that it seemed like there was a degree of racism involved in this. So generally speaking, Icelanders were looked down upon in society. It was a very waspish society in early 20th century Winnipeg.
Just like they had done 15 years earlier, they formed their own team. When they were denied entry into the CD Senior League, they formed the Manitoba Hockey League with teams from Brandon and Selkirk. Fred Steamer Maxwell was the coach and manager. Now, he had played for various Winnipeg teams and was considered one of the best players of his time. He played for 5 seasons with the Winnipeg Monarchs in the early 1910s, where he scored 21 goals and 25 points in 37 games. He built the returning Falcons into one of the best teams, not just in Winnipeg or Manitoba, but Canada. By his side were former Falcons Gordon Hofdahl as trainer and Hebby Axford as club president. And on the ice at center was Captain Frank Frederickson. Magnus Goodman was on the left wing, Holder Halderson on the right. The defense was patrolled by Conrad Johansson and Robert Benson, and the net was guarded by the stone wall named Wally Byron. Alan Woodman served as the rover, a position that has now been eliminated from hockey, while Chris Fridfridson was a substitute. They may have been away from hockey during the war, but upon their return it was clear they hadn't lost any of their edge or their skill. The Victoria Daily Times wrote on December 22, 1919, The visitors were completely outclassed throughout and were never dangerous, while the Icelandic boys were noisy and aggressive. Fredriksson and Johansson starred for the winners. During the 1919-1920 season, the Falcons took first place in the Manitoba Hockey League as Frank Fredriksson scored 23 goals in 10 games, while Wally Byron led the league in shutouts. They would play for the league championship against the Selkirk Fishermen in front of a crowd of 5,000 people at the amphitheater rink in Winnipeg. The Falcons won the first of 2 games 5-1. In the second, they fell behind early and were down 5-1 before the second period. They dug deep and had an unbelievable third where they scored 4 goals to tie the game. It would all come down to an overtime win. The Falcons scored and took the Manitoba Hockey League championship. With a championship under their belts, they now had to face the Fort William Maple Leafs, who were the champions of the Thunder Bay region. This was the next step to eventually competing for the Allen Cup against an Eastern Canada team. In the series, the Falcons had speed and size on their side. They wiped the ice clean with the Maple Leafs and took the first game 7-2. Now, if that beating wasn't enough, the Leafs would be humiliated even more in the second game when the Falcons won with a resounding 9-1 score for the win. The Ottawa Journal wrote that the Falcons had, quote, frequent flashes of real and spasmodic genius, end quote. Those 2 wins secured the Falcons a bid at the national championship, the Allen Cup. During the first decade of the trophy's existence, a Winnipeg team won it 5 times. Now the Winnipeg Falcons were hoping for glory. The Allen Cup was born out of a schism in Canadian hockey. Sir H. Montague Allen, a businessman and president of the Montreal Amateur Athletic Association, had provided a trophy named after him to be presented to the Canadian amateur hockey champion. That had been the role of the Stanley Cup, but by the early 1900s, teams were paying players on the down low to bolster their squads. Eventually, the Eastern Canada Amateur Hockey Association allowed professionals in the league, and the trustees of the Stanley Cup decided that the trophy would only be awarded to professional teams. This meant that amateur teams had their own national championship. And at the end of the 1919-1920 season, the Falcons would be facing the University of Toronto Blues for the Cup, and most pundits didn't give them much of a chance. Even the Falcons believed they didn't belong, and expected to be home before long and only packed enough clothes for a few days. The decision to pack light would prove to be foolish. The Falcons had grown up together. They had grown up playing against and with each other on frozen ponds in frigid Manitoba. They had seen the ravages of war and had been ostracized by their city and been there for each other every step of the way. When you think of the word team, the Falcons were that, a unit that looked out for one another on and off the ice. Whenever they hit the ice, they carried the memory of Frank Thorstenson and George Cumbers with them. Meanwhile, the Toronto University Blues had only just been assembled and played together that year. The Falcons would prove to be impossible to beat. The Edmonton Journal wrote, "The Allen Cup goes west after an absence of 3 years, and judging by the ability of the new holders, it may be a long time before it comes back again." Now, with the Amateur National Championship under their belt, the Falcons did something else other than take home hardware. They had earned a trip to Belgium. In 2 weeks, they would be competing at the Olympics. Remember when I said that the Falcons players packed light for their trip to Toronto? Well, now that was a problem. They were about to head to Antwerp, Belgium to play at the Olympics, and they needed enough clothes to last them a few weeks. So who would save the day? The citizens of Winnipeg. The same people who made them feel unwelcomed raised $500 to outfit the team. The Falcons would depart for Europe alongside W.A. Hewitt, a representative of the Canadian Olympic Committee. He would oversee finances and report for Canadian newspapers. Hewitt and his wife Flora became parental figures for the Falcons on their Olympic journey, while the couple's 18-year-old son remained in Canada. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because Foster Hewitt, their son, would eventually become the voice of Hockey Night in Canada. But at the time, he waved his parents goodbye as they joined the Falcons on the SS Malaita. The ship departed from St. John, New Brunswick for Europe. The 1920 Summer Olympics in Antwerp, Belgium were the first Olympics since the First World War had broken out. Previous one had been hosted 8 years earlier in Stockholm, Sweden. Antwerp was awarded the Games as a tribute to the Belgian people who had suffered during the 4 years of conflict. The Games would feature only 29 nations, with Hungary, Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire all banned for their role in the Great War. This would be the first Games to feature hockey, which would be played at the Summer Olympics. You heard that right. Ice hockey at the Summer Olympics. But that's because the Winter Olympics wouldn't exist until 1924. 7 nations, Belgium, Canada, Czechoslovakia, France, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United States, all took part in the hockey tournament, which would be played at the Ice Palace of Antwerp. Each game would consist of 2 20-minute periods, and if the game was tied, there would be 5-minute overtime periods until someone scored. Heading into the tournament, Canada was the clear favorite. The United States was expected to be the toughest competition, but that's because half their team was made up of Canadians. On April 20th, the Victoria Daily Times wrote, "The players from the Dominion have been given a great reception by the British Army contingent stationed here and will have a strong rooters chorus to give them encouragement during the games." As soon as the Falcons hit the ice, their size and physicality scared the other teams. The Europeans padded their uniforms, gloves, and skates with cotton. Some even lined their shins with magazines. David Grebstad said that many of the players in Europe were brand new to hockey.
Sweden almost had no equipment. I think they had to borrow equipment from people, and I think their hockey team was a soccer team that just said, well, let's try playing hockey mere weeks before the Olympics. It was very lopsided, and of course the Falcons were an amazing team, so you add that talent and the very fact that they've been playing together for years, it was no contest.
To help them, the Falcons started to coach the Europeans during practices. Hewitt said in one of his dispatches, quote, "We virtually train the Swedes, Czechoslovaks, Belgians, and French teams for their contests against us." Even with the Canadians' help, the games weren't even close. The Falcons demolished the Czechs 15-0 on April 25th as Frank Fredrickson scored 4 goals. The Weekly Albertan wrote, "The Falcons were clearly the superior team and played short passes at a terrific speed." For their second game, they would face the United States and they would put up a fight. No one scored for the first 20 minutes. At the beginning of the second, Frank Fredrickson put one in the net to give the Falcons the lead, and the Brits in the crowd gave him a standing ovation. The Americans attempted to get past the strong Falcon defense but were denied even with Wally Byron's broken finger. Connie Johansson scored late in the game to give Canada a 2-0 victory. Then it was on to the gold medal game against Sweden. They wouldn't prove to be a challenge. 6 minutes into the first period, the Falcons were up 3-0. However, the Swedish team did something no other team in the tournament had accomplished so far. They scored on Wally Byron. Kind of. Because, well, he fell, shall we say. Nearly everyone believed that the Canadians had given Sweden a gimme goal as a sign of sportsmanship. The Swedish team even thanked the Falcons right after they scored. Fredrickson said, "I guess it's safe to confess that we gave it to them. The Swedes went wild. They were yelling and cheering, shaking hands with themselves, shaking hands with us. It was great." With that bit of charity out of the way, the Canadians got back to business, and by the time it was all said and done, they were up 12-1. In the last 24 minutes of the game, Frank Fredrickson scored 6 goals. The Toronto Globe wrote that their performance was like the gallantry of Canadian troops on Belgian soil in the defense of Ypres in the Great War. The Falcons were Olympic champions, and they didn't know it yet. But at that game in Antwerp, they had won the first of 14 gold medals for Canada in hockey to come. The Swedish team didn't leave empty-handed. They took home the silver medals and the Falcons' hockey sticks as a gesture of goodwill from the Canadians. The Vancouver Daily World wrote, "The victory of the Canadian team was fully expected, it being regarded largely as a question of the size of the score the Canadians would run up against their sturdy but less experienced opponents." The Falcons were ready to return to Canada as Olympic heroes. But first, they had one stop to make. While Canada waited for their arrival, the Falcons walked through the battlefields of France. The scars on the land and in the minds of the players were still fresh. They toured the trenches, saw the wreckage, and thought of those left behind, including their 2 former teammates. It was a sobering moment after the high of winning gold at the Olympics. After paying their respects, they boarded their ship for the trip home. The week at sea gave them time to decompress before 2,000 people would greet them in Toronto. Once they reached Winnipeg, they were welcomed as conquerors, and a half-day holiday was even proclaimed in the province. At a huge banquet, each Falcon was given a gold watch. Then they were honored with a 2-kilometer-long parade made up of 200 cars, trucks, and horse-drawn buggies. The Saskatoon Star-Phoenix wrote, "Winnipeg is making great preparations for the reception. The Civic Fathers will tender the boys a banquet, and there will be a grand parade in the city. All sport followers in the Manitoba capital will turn out to honor the champions." David Grebstad said Canada's response to their win was amazing.
It really was something spectacular, I imagine, from at least what I can see from reading the contemporary newspaper accounts, that it was eye-opening and world-changing. Not only did they just come through this disastrous war, everybody got hit by the Spanish flu pandemic. There was massive civil unrest in Winnipeg, leading to the Winnipeg General Strike. So there wasn't a lot to cheer about. And then suddenly there was this one bit of great news, especially for Winnipeg, Winnipeg fell on hard times. They were a boom city up until the war, and the war kind of put the kibosh on that.
But good things aren't always meant to last, and soon individual needs superseded the team. At the start of the 1920-21 season, Manitoba League President H.J. Sterling hired a private investigator because he was suspicious of a few of the Falcon players who'd recently changed their addresses to play on new teams. He wanted to determine if they were being paid under the table. Holder Halderson and Robert Benson had both moved to Saskatoon, and after the investigation, their amateur cards were revoked because they were paid $6,500 to play hockey for the Saskatoon team. That team was also banned from competing in the 1921 Allen Cup. But by then, nearly every player was playing for a professional team, and the Falcons, as they had existed, disappeared, and their golden glory dimmed. For decades, the Falcons were not celebrated for their Olympic victory. Hockey Canada listed the 1924 Toronto Granites as the first Olympic gold medalists, but by the late 20th century, things began to change. Brian Johansson, the son of Falcons player Connie Johansson, started a website to document the team's history, which led the Canadian Olympic Committee to recognize the Falcons as the first gold medal winning team. By the 2004 World Cup of Hockey, Hockey Canada used replica yellow and black jerseys as alternative jerseys to honor the Falcons. 10 years later, the Winnipeg Falcons story was told in a Heritage Minute, starring Letterkenny's Jared Keeso as Hebby Axford. On July 31st, 2019, Parks Canada recognized the Falcons' win as a national historic event. Then the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto created a permanent display to honor the Falcons and their victory at the Olympics. The team's also been inducted into the Manitoba Hockey Hall of Fame, but their legacy has gone far beyond Canadian borders. The Icelandic national hockey team honors the Falcons on their jersey by using the falcon and the maple leaf as their emblem. But what happened to the players after they achieved Olympic glory? Robert Benson continued to play hockey until 1932 and joined the Boston Bruins for 8 games during the 1924-25 season. After he retired, he worked as a clerk for Eaton's and coached various minor league hockey teams. Alan Woodman played hockey until 1925. Holder Halderson played until 1937. He played with the Victoria Cougars and added a Stanley Cup to his trophy case. Chris Fridrinson took a job as a clerk at the Dominion Bank. When he passed away in 1938 at the age of 40, he was the first of the gold medal winning team to die. Magnus Goodman played mostly in the American Hockey Association with various teams in Duluth and Kansas City until 1939. Throughout his life, he carried his gold medal in his pocket. Conrad Johansson played until 1929, then went on to train 231 pilots during the Second World War. Wally Byron retired from hockey in 1925 and coached various teams in the minor leagues. As for Frank Fredrickson, he took his leadership skills to the NHL and played from 1926 to 1931 with the Detroit Cougars, Boston Bruins, and Pittsburgh Pirates. In 161 games, he had 71 points and won the Stanley Cup with his friend and Falcons teammate Holder Halderson in 1925. In 1958, he was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame, the only member of the Falcons to be enshrined. And until 1998, when NHL players began playing in the Olympics, he was considered the greatest hockey player to ever represent Canada at the Games. David Grebstad says that in the end, the Falcons' legacy is not just the gold medal, but what they endured to become champions.
You know, it's a great story of grit, of determination, of camaraderie, the obstacles that these men overcame. in order to achieve what they did.
I hope you enjoyed that episode and our look at the Winnipeg Falcons. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.